The studio lights burned brighter than anyone expected. It wasn't just the cameras, or the giant screens, or even the live audience packed into every corner of the room. It was the feeling, something electric, something sharp, like the air itself was holding its breath. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3. And suddenly, the world was watching. Oprah Winfrey sat center stage, a living icon of power and influence. Her smile, as always, was calm, warm, inviting, but there was something else behind her eyes tonight. Something no one could quite read. Across from her sat Jonathan Roumie, the man who had taken Hollywood by storm. The man who had played Jesus on screen and left millions speechless with his performance. And now, he was about to be tested in real life. On live television, before a crowd of millions. Before people waiting, some hoping, to see him fail. The camera panned close. Every line of tension was visible on his face. But he didn't flinch, not once. Oprah leaned forward. "So, Jonathan," she began, her voice smooth, "you've been very open about your faith. Very vocal, in an industry that doesn't always welcome that." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," a small smile, humble, almost too humble. Oprah's eyes narrowed. "Some people," she continued carefully, "say faith like yours, well, it's outdated. Old-fashioned, even naive." The audience chuckled. A few gasps slipped through the laughter. Oprah didn't smile this time. She let the words hang in the air like smoke. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, long enough for the audience to feel it in their chests. Long enough for Twitter to start typing. And then, Jonathan spoke. "Ma'am," he said softly, "may I tell you a story?" Oprah blinked. The audience leaned in. Something in his voice, steady, calm, but trembling with emotion, cut through the room like a blade. Oprah nodded once. "Go ahead," she said. Jonathan took a slow breath. "Years ago," he began, "before the fame, before the cameras, before anyone even knew my name, I was at a point in my life where I had nothing. Nothing but my faith. And someone told me that was worthless too." He paused. Oprah crossed her arms, curious now. Jonathan continued. "They laughed at me," he said quietly. "Said faith doesn't pay bills. Faith doesn't make dreams come true. Faith doesn't get you anywhere in this world." His voice cracked just slightly. The audience shifted in their seats. Jonathan swallowed hard. "But I learned something," he whispered. "Something that night I'll never forget." Oprah leaned forward again. "And what was that?" she asked. Jonathan met her eyes. "That faith," he said slowly, "is the only reason I'm alive to sit here today." The room went silent, not the kind of silence that comes from boredom. The kind that comes when people realize they weren't ready to hear what came next. Oprah tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Go on," she said softly. Jonathan nodded. "I was living out of my car," he continued. "Broke, alone, wondering if my life had any purpose at all. And then, one night, I prayed. Not a fancy prayer, not a church prayer, just, from my gut. I told God, if you're real, I need you to show me. Because I can't do this anymore." A murmur rippled through the audience. Oprah watched him closely. Jonathan's voice shook now. "I woke up the next morning," he said, "to a call from a director I'd auditioned for months earlier. He said, 'We want you for the role.'" Oprah blinked. "The role?" she asked. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "The role of Jesus." The audience gasped. Oprah's lips parted just slightly. But she stayed silent. Jonathan's hands trembled in his lap. "That's when I realized," he whispered, "faith isn't about what you see. It's about what you hold on to, when you can't see anything at all." The cameras zoomed in. Every eye was locked on him now. Oprah cleared her throat. "So," she said carefully, "you believe that was divine intervention?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe it was the answer to a prayer I was too desperate to make sound pretty." The audience was still silent. Jonathan leaned back slowly. "And maybe," he added softly, "that's why people mock faith. Because they can't explain it. Because it doesn't fit into neat little boxes." Oprah studied him for a long moment. The tension in the air was thick now. "Jonathan," she said slowly, "do you ever wonder if maybe faith is just a coincidence we tell ourselves to feel better?" Jonathan held her gaze. And for the first time all night, he smiled. A small, knowing smile. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "Because I've lived the alternative. And it almost killed me." The audience stirred again. Oprah's brow furrowed slightly. Jonathan's voice dropped lower. I know what it feels like, he said, to wake up with nothing but darkness in your chest. To wonder if the world would even notice if you didn't wake up at all. The audience grew still. Jonathan swallowed hard. And I know what it feels like, he whispered, to ask God for a sign, and then get one. Oprah shifted in her seat. Her tone changed now, softer, more careful. Jonathan, she said, what sign did you get? Jonathan's eyes glistened under the lights. He hesitated. Then he whispered the words that made the audience lean forward, hearts pounding. The sign, he said slowly, was that the world didn't change, but I did. Oprah tilted her head. Jonathan continued before she could speak. That's when I realized, he said softly, faith doesn't always fix your life overnight. Sometimes, it just keeps you alive long enough to see it get better. The words hit like a thunderclap. The audience erupted in applause. Oprah blinked in surprise. But Jonathan wasn't finished. Because this wasn't just about faith. This was about something much bigger. And the next thing he said would make headlines for weeks. The applause finally faded, but the air in the studio didn't feel lighter. It felt heavier, like everyone was waiting for the real storm to hit. Oprah leaned forward again. There was a glint in her eyes now. Not cruel, not hostile, but sharp. She was about to push him. Hard. Jonathan, she said slowly, you keep talking about faith like it's the answer to everything. But what about the people who pray, and nothing happens? The people who cry out, and still lose everything. The people who believe, and still suffer. The audience murmured. Jonathan didn't move. Oprah pressed on. Do you really believe, she asked carefully, that God answers you, but not them? The words hung there, cold, accusing. Even the cameramen froze. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. For the first time, he looked shaken. But only for a moment. He leaned forward slowly. No, ma'am, he said softly. I don't believe that. Oprah raised a brow. Then what do you believe? She asked. Jonathan's voice was quieter now. But it carried through the entire room. I believe, he said, that faith isn't a transaction. It's not a magic formula. It's not about praying hard enough to get what you want. Oprah studied him. Jonathan swallowed hard. I believe, he continued, faith is about holding on, even when you don't get what you want. A few people in the audience nodded slowly. But Oprah wasn't letting go. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. So you're saying, she said carefully, that sometimes, faith is just suffering with no reward. Jonathan looked down at his hands. His voice cracked slightly. Yes, ma'am, he said softly. Sometimes it is. But sometimes, it's the only thing keeping you breathing through the suffering. The audience stirred. Oprah tilted her head. But Jonathan, she said slowly, what kind of God asks people to suffer? What kind of God sits back and watches? The tension in the room thickened. Jonathan didn't answer right away. His silence was loud. Finally, he looked up. His eyes glistened under the stage lights. The kind, he whispered, who suffers with them. Oprah blinked. The audience went still again. Jonathan's voice was shaking now. When I played Jesus, he said softly, I read the stories over and over. The miracles, the healings, the crowds. But do you know what hit me hardest? Oprah shook her head slightly. Jonathan swallowed. It was the shortest verse in the Bible, he said. Just 2 words. Jesus wept. The audience barely breathed. Jonathan leaned forward. People think faith means God fixes everything, he whispered. But sometimes, it just means he's there. Crying with you. Holding you up when you can't stand anymore. Oprah shifted in her seat. Her tone softened, just a little. So you're saying, she asked slowly, God doesn't always stop the pain, but he feels it. Jonathan nodded once. Yes, ma'am, he said. And sometimes, that's enough to get you through one more day. Oprah looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, but Jonathan, what about the people who lose their faith completely? Who just give up? Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was fire there. I was one of them, he said softly. Oprah straightened slightly. Jonathan's voice was low now. I walked away once, he admitted. I thought God had abandoned me. Thought maybe the whole thing was a lie. Oprah tilted her head. What brought you back? She asked. Jonathan's hands trembled in his lap. A stranger, he said softly. Someone I met in a coffee shop. He didn't know me, didn't know my story. But he looked at me and said, I don't know why I'm saying this, but God wants you to know he hasn't forgotten you. Oprah's lips parted slightly. Jonathan nodded slowly. That's when I realized, he whispered, faith isn't always about you finding God. Sometimes, it's about him finding you. The audience stirred again. Oprah leaned back in her chair. She looked at him for a long time. And then, she smirked slightly. Jonathan, she said softly, do you really believe God sent a stranger into a coffee shop just for you? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am, he said simply. Because that day, I was ready to give up. And instead, I walked out of that coffee shop with hope I couldn't explain. The audience shifted again. Oprah's smile faded slowly. Or, she said carefully, maybe it was just coincidence. Jonathan met her eyes. And for the first time, his voice didn't shake at all. No, ma'am, he said softly. Coincidence doesn't change the course of a life. But grace does. The audience murmured. Jonathan leaned back slightly. And that, he said softly, is why I'm sitting here right now. Because of grace, not coincidence. Oprah didn't respond right away. She just stared at him. The tension in the room was thick now. Because everyone knew, something bigger was coming. And when it did, it would leave the entire audience stunned. The silence after Jonathan's last words stretched long. Oprah shifted in her seat again. Something in her expression changed. She wasn't smirking anymore. She was studying him, like she was trying to read what was behind his calm voice. Finally, she leaned forward. Jonathan, she said softly, you talk about grace, about faith, like they're solid things. Like you can build your life on them. But what about the people whose lives fall apart? The mothers who lose their children? The families destroyed by war? The people whose prayers go unanswered? Her voice rose slightly. Do you look them in the eye, she demanded, and tell them God is with them while they bury their child? The audience gasped softly. Jonathan didn't flinch. He looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked back up. His voice was low, steady. Yes, ma'am, he said softly. Because I've been there. The audience stirred. Oprah blinked. You, she said quietly. Jonathan nodded slowly. I've stood at a funeral, he whispered. I've watched someone I loved lowered into the ground. I've felt the kind of silence that crushes your chest. The kind where you beg God to explain himself, and all you hear is nothing. The studio went completely still. Oprah didn't speak. Jonathan's voice cracked now. But that's when I learned, he said softly, that God doesn't always give answers. Sometimes, he just gives his presence. He paused. Sometimes, he said, the only thing keeping you from falling apart is the sense that he's sitting in the ashes with you. Oprah leaned back slowly. She didn't smirk this time. Her eyes flickered. Something sharp, and maybe painful, crossed her face. Jonathan leaned forward. People think faith is about never doubting, he said softly. But it's not. It's about clinging to hope, even when your hands are shaking. Oprah's voice softened slightly. And what if hope runs out? She asked. Jonathan's eyes glistened under the lights. Then, he said softly, you borrow someone else's until yours comes back. The audience murmured again. Jonathan took a slow breath. Faith, he said, isn't about pretending life doesn't hurt. It's about believing pain isn't the end of the story. Oprah sat very still. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Jonathan went on. When I played Jesus, he said softly, I thought the hardest scenes would be the miracles. Feeding the crowds, healing the sick, raising the dead. But you know what stayed with me the longest? Oprah shook her head slightly. The moment on the cross, he whispered. The moment he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jonathan's voice cracked. Because even Jesus, he said softly, knew what it felt like to feel abandoned. The room was silent now. Completely silent. Jonathan swallowed hard. And if he can cry out like that, he whispered, so can we. Oprah's lips parted slightly. Jonathan leaned back slowly. That's what faith means, he said softly. Not hiding your pain, not pretending everything's fine, but believing there's meaning, even when you can't see it yet. Oprah stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't say a word. The audience didn't move, because everyone felt it. The shift, the weight of what he just said. And they knew, something was breaking open inside her too. The arena felt like the air had been ripped from its lungs. Benny Hinn lay still, his body surrounded by trembling hands. Paramedics rushed forward, their faces tight with urgency. But above the panic, one voice carried, a voice that didn't shout, but cut through like thunder. Jonathan Roumie knelt beside him. His lips trembled, his eyes brimmed, and then, softly but firmly, he whispered, Jesus, you are here. The entire crowd fell into a silence so sharp it felt like glass. Jonathan placed his hand gently over Benny's chest. If you still have work for him to do, Lord, breathe life back into him. For a moment, nothing moved. No one spoke. The sound of a single sob echoed from the back rows. And then, Benny's chest rose. A collective gasp swept the arena. Eyes widened. People clutched at one another's arms in disbelief. Benny coughed, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked against the blinding lights above him, disoriented but alive. Jonathan's tears broke free, streaming down his cheeks as he helped him sit up. "Jonathan," Benny whispered, his voice raspy but clear enough to be heard. He really is here." Jonathan nodded, holding his friend close. "He never left." The crowd erupted, but it wasn't chaos, it was worship. People fell to their knees. Hands stretched toward the heavens. The roar was not applause, but prayer. And then Benny, frail but burning with conviction, pulled himself to his feet with Jonathan's support. His voice cracked but carried through every corner of the arena. "Do you understand?" he cried. "Do you see what just happened here? This is not about me. This is not about Jonathan. This is Jesus, reminding us that he is alive, that he still heals, that he still moves." The crowd shouted back, voices colliding into one great storm of faith. Tears streamed down faces young and old. The atmosphere became electric, charged with something no camera, no microphone could ever truly capture. Jonathan stood behind him, his face glowing with awe. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment spoke louder than words ever could. Benny turned, gripping Jonathan's hand tightly, his frailty swallowed up in conviction. "Brother, you spoke his truth. And when you did, he came." Jonathan's voice cracked. "I'm just a servant." Benny smiled weakly but fiercely. "That's all he's ever asked us to be." The arena shook with worship. It wasn't about a show anymore. It wasn't about personalities, or names, or ministries. It was about a presence so real it had just shaken the world awake. As the night stretched on, countless lives were changed. People testified of healing, of freedom, of faith reborn. But long after the lights dimmed, long after the cameras shut off, one truth remained seared into every heart present. When Jonathan Roumie spoke the name of Jesus, something eternal moved. And when Benny Hinn collapsed, it wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a reminder, a call, that Jesus is still here. Still speaking, still reaching for a world desperate to remember him. And that night, millions would come to know it. Not through spectacle, not through fame, but through one fragile collapse. And one unstoppable name.